Greetings. This is Dennis Regling with GoDeeperBibleStudy.com, and today we're going to be looking at the importance of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, collections of ancient Hebrew writings, and Greek writings, which are important, I believe, to our study of the Old and New Testaments. Now, the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible, consists of a collection of writings dating from approximately the 13th through the 3rd centuries BC. These books were included in the Jewish canon by the Talmudic sages around the end of the 1st century of AD, after the destruction of the Second Temple. However, there's a lot of Jewish writings from the Second Temple period which are not in the Tanakh. And these are known as the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. The Apocrypha, which is a Greek word for hidden books, are Jewish books from the period not preserved in the Tanakh, but they are included in the Latin Vulgate and the Greek Septuagint of the Old Testament. The Apocrypha are still regarded as part of the canon of the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches, and as such their number is fixed. The Pseudepigrapha, which is Greek for falsely attributed, was given to the Jewish writings of the same period, which were attributed to authors who did not actually write them. It's very common for someone to write something and then they would put, the name of maybe an author or who the book was about. This is widespread in Greco-Roman antiquity in Jewish, Christian, and pagan circles alike. Books were attributed to pagan authors, and names were drawn from the repertoire of biblical personalities such as Adam, Noah, Enoch, Abraham, Moses, Elijah, Ezekiel, Baruch, and Jeremiah. The Pseudepigrapha resemble the Apocrypha in general character, yet were not included in the Bible, in the Apocrypha, or in rabbinic literature. All the Apocrypha and most of the Pseudepigrapha are Jewish works, although some of the Pseudepigrapha do contain Christianizing additions. They provide essential evidence of Jewish literature and Jewish thought, during the period between the end of the biblical writing, which is about 400 BC, and the beginning of substantial rabbinic literature in the latter part of the 1st century. They have aroused much scholarly interest, since they provide information about Judaism at the turn of the era between the Bible and the Mishnah, or the biblical law and oral law, and help explain how rabbinic Judaism and Christianity came into being. You will see a lot of times their influence in the New Testament. Jesus actually does quote from the Apocrypha. Jude and Peter make references to the book of Enoch, which is in the Pseudepigrapha. Now, the oldest known Jewish work not included in the Bible is the Book of Enoch. It's a complex work. It's written in the 3rd, maybe the late 4th century before Christ, BC, but after the return from the Babylonian exile and the establishment of the Second Jewish Commonwealth in the 6th to 5th centuries BC, and before the Maccabean revolt in 172 BC. The oldest copies of the Book of Enoch, dating from the 3rd century BC, were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The latest of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha are the apocalypses of Ezra and Baruch, written in the decades following the Roman destruction of the Temple in 70 AD. These works, contemporary with those of the early rabbinic school of Yevne, reflect the theological, ethical struggles and dilemmas aroused by the Roman conquest of Judea and the destruction of the Temple. Most of these works were written in the land of Israel in Aramaic or Hebrew. However, some of them, such as the Wisdom of Solomon, were written in Greek. These Jewish Greek writings were produced in the widespread Jewish diaspora of the time, mainly in Egypt and in North Africa. Although most of the Hebrew and Aramaic texts have been lost over the centuries, many of them translated into Greek or Oriental Christian languages, such as the Ethiopic, Syriac, or Armenian, have been found. Early Christianity showed great interest in Jewish traditions and stories about biblical figures and events. And as a result, scholars now have substantial library of Jewish writing created during a crucial period of Jewish history, but reserved only within the Christian tradition. Certain of the apocryphal works were known in Jewish tradition among the Middle Ages, not necessarily in their full text, but in shortened and retold versions, or in translations back into Hebrew or Aramaic from Christian languages. Thus, forms of the books of Judith, Maccabees, and Ben Sirah, as well as parts of the Wisdom of Solomon, were familiar to Jewish scholars. But these works never achieved wide acceptance in Judaism and remained, for the most part, as curiosities. During the Renaissance in Europe and the following centuries, an interest in various Oriental languages developed in Christian circles. First Hebrew, then Aramaic, Ethiopic, Syriac, and more took the place along Greek and Latin in the scholarly purview. At the same time, Christian scholars began to be interested in rabbinic sources and Jewish biblical exegesis. This combined interest in language and rabbinics was an important component in the complex development that, by the end of the 18th century, provided the basis for modern critical biblical scholarship. The Dead Sea Scrolls made a huge impact. Scholarly interest was greatly renewed after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. In the 11 caves near Qumran, northwest of the Dead Sea, parts of more than 700 ancient Jewish manuscripts were discovered. These have been written in the same period as the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha, mostly in Hebrew, with a few in Aramaic and even a fewer in Greek. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as they came to be known, are assumed to have been the library of a sectarian community at Qumran. These scrolls survived the Roman ravaging in Judea in the years 68 to 70 AD because they were hidden in caves. They've been a major focus of scholarly and general interest for the last half century. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls were a number of manuscripts of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, including 10 manuscripts of the Book of Enoch in the original Aramaic, which were vital to answering many questions about its origins. Dating of the manuscripts by their script shows that certain parts of Enoch are at least as old as the 3rd century BC. Fragments of Ben Sirah in Hebrew, Tobit in Aramaic, and the Epistle of Jeremiah in Greek and others were also found at Qumran. In addition to these discoveries, the scrolls included other similar writings that were previously unknown. In a psalm scroll from Qumran, a number of additional compositions, more psalms, were discovered, thereby increasing the corpus of text already known. They also assisted in understanding a literary genre, the later psalms, which happen to be poorly represented in the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. These powerful poems provide a deep insight into the religious feelings and sentiments of their authors. The knowledge that a lively literary production of psalms existed at that time means that any study of ancient Jewish literature must now take these apocryphal psalms very seriously into account. A third important aspect of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they were discovered in a known archaeological and sociological context, firmly fixing them in the Second Temple period. Before 1947, only medieval Christian manuscripts of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha were known, and they could only be dated based on the basis of details contained in them. This is not always a dependable procedure. The Dead Sea Scrolls, stemming from a clearly established archaeological context, are now vital in dating the writings accurately. The dispensationalists want to say that the whole 70th week is in the future and that all these things are happening on these false assumptions. But when we look at it, who confirmed the covenant for 1 week? Jesus, in his ministry, he said, I come to fulfill the law. Okay, Jesus fulfilled the law. What was the law? The law was the covenant between God and the Israelites given through Moses. He confirmed the covenant. He kept the covenant. Okay, he fulfilled it, confirmed it, fulfilled it. In Christ, the whole law was fulfilled. Something Israel could not do in the flesh, Christ did in his flesh. In the middle of the week, it says he causes the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Well, Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years, half of the 70th week, and then he was crucified. Okay, in Daniel 9:26, it says after the 69 weeks, the seven weeks and 62 weeks, shall Messiah be cut off or killed, but not for himself. Christ was crucified. He was crucified not for his sins. Pilate said he's innocent. I mean, I see no guilt in him. He had never sinned. He died for the people. He was cut off, but not for himself. And when Christ was crucified, he was the final sacrifice. That put the end to temple sacrifices as far as them having any meaning. The temple sacrifices had no meaning after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He put an end to Old Testament sacrifices. He confirmed the covenant. He ended the old covenant. He brought in the new covenant. So those Old Testament sacrifices no longer had meaning. And within that generation, 40 years later, the temple was completely destroyed. There is no more sacrifice. And it says, for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. Make what desolate? Well, we got to back up. The people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay. And as I already read, Luke, Mark, Matthew, all put that abomination of desolation with the destruction of the temple, the sanctuary, in the first century. When you see and you read and understand what God had told Daniel, and you see the fulfillment of all this in the first century, dispensationalism completely collapses. Dispensationalism must have a third temple. It must have a covenant between some mysterious Antichrist person and the Jewish people. It must. Then there's a rapture before this tribulation. They try to make the tribulation, the 70th week of Daniel, which it does not say. They want to have a 7-year tribulation. Well, that 70th week is a 7-year tribulation, and yet nowhere in the Bible are the words tribulation and 7 years put together. The Revelation does not talk about a 7-year tribulation. When Jesus mentions that there will be a great tribulation during the destruction of the temple in that time period, in this generation, the generation he was talking to, he says nothing about being 7 years. We do see it lasting 3.5 years, starting with the war of the Jews and Vespasian coming in and burning and destroying Jewish cities, the cities in Judea, on his way to Jerusalem. And then Titus finishing up in Jerusalem when Vespasian went back to Rome. And, 3.5 years, which is 42 months, which is 1,240 days by Jewish calendars, is mentioned throughout Revelation. And we can see these connections. Dispensationalism lives or dies on their interpretation of the 70th week of Daniel, and there is absolutely no reason to read Daniel chapter 9 and say, oh, there must be a 2, 3, 4,000, 10,000 year gap between the 69th and 70th week. There's no reason to look at that and say, oh, well, they're going to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild. That's when the 70 weeks starts, 490 years. But they had to put in a third temple, which is certainly not mentioned in Daniel, certainly not mentioned in the New Testament, certainly not mentioned in the Bible. They have to have a covenant between some Antichrist person, some satanic leader, and yet the only person who makes covenants with Israel is God. And he made two. The first covenant, which Christ confirmed during his ministry, or fulfilled, and the new covenant, which started with the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus dispensationalism just does not stand. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe to this video. I am working on a series on the book of Revelation, starting with Old Testament prophets. This would be part of it. And it'll probably take me a full year to complete the whole study. This is not going to be a wham, bam, here's Revelation, we're done. It's going to take time to break things down, to see what the Old Testament prophets said, how they're referenced in Revelation, and then to actually get into Revelation chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Again, I thank you for listening. This is Dennis Regling. Peace be with you.